They ignored my wedding. Now they expect me to cover their luxury retirement. I was always the second option in my family. I, Jason, 31, grew up in the shadow of my younger sister, Chloe. From an early age, it was clear that my parents considered her their dream child, smart, athletic, and with a promising future in Silicon Valley. While she received trophies and recognition, I tried to find my own path without the support she naturally received. It was no secret to anyone that I attended our family gatherings. The looks and comments made it clear that there was a perfect son in the family, and it wasn't me. For years, I tried to impress them, chasing validation like it was oxygen. I fought for better grades, prestigious jobs, anything that could make my parents look at me with the same pride they reserved for her. Eventually, I stopped trying. It was liberating to realize that I didn't need their approval to be happy. I built my own life, genuine relationships, and a career that, while not extraordinary in their eyes, brought me satisfaction every day. When I met Emma, I felt like I had finally found someone who valued me for who I really was. After 4 years together, I decided to ask her to marry me. I was nervous about informing my parents about the engagement, not because of the moment itself, but because of the obligation to include them in this part of my life. The news was received with forced expressions and mechanical congratulations that did not hide his true reaction. At the engagement party, while everyone was celebrating, I caught my parents in a far corner, talking on the phone to my sister who seemed to be crying on the other end. At that moment, Emma realized before I did, they were comforting Chloe because I was stealing the spotlight by getting married first. Their behavior throughout the wedding planning period was distant. We sent the formal invitations, repeatedly checked to see if they had been received, but the response never came. On the big day, I looked at the first row reserved for the groom's parents and found only empty chairs. Their absence from my wedding was a clearer message than any words could express. After the ceremony, when family members asked where my parents were, I avoided direct answers so as not to turn my day into a family drama. But the doubt remained with me for days. When I finally managed to reach them on the phone, I was greeted with an absurd accusation. "How could you get married without even inviting us?" As they listened to my confusion, I double-checked the invitation records, both physical and digital, that they had been sent correctly. The attempt at manipulation was evident. They were rewriting history to cast themselves as victims, when in fact they had deliberately chosen not to attend. The conversation made it clear that they would never admit the truth. The idea that I could marry before their favorite daughter was unacceptable to them. It was Emma who noticed the signs I had ignored. As we reviewed what happened, she reminded me of how uncomfortable my parents had seemed since announcing their engagement. "Jason, they weren't surprised by the invitation. They were disturbed by the order of events," she explained. The pain of rejection was intensified by the realization that even in such a significant moment, they prioritized my sister's feelings over mine. That day, I made a decision that I should have made much earlier, to completely cut off contact with my parents. Years of keeping up appearances and enduring crumbs of attention had taken a toll on my mental health. Although the decision was difficult, I felt immediate relief, as if I could finally breathe without the constant weight of their disapproval. Emma supported my decision unconditionally, reinforcing that families are built on bonds of love and respect, not just blood. The following months were of discovery and healing. For the first time, I didn't worry about what my parents would think of my choices. Every decision was completely mine, from career changes to decorating our home. When asked by relatives about the separation, I honestly shared what had happened. I did not exaggerate or diminish the situation. I simply told the facts as they happened. I explained that my parents had intentionally missed my wedding, that they tried to make me believe that they had not received the invitation, and that, when confronted, they chose to continue denying the truth. I didn't seek sympathy or try to portray them as monsters. I just let their actions speak for themselves. What I didn't expect was the impact this honesty would have on the extended family. Uncles, cousins, and even grandparents began to see my parents in a new light, questioning years of behavior they had tolerated in the name of family harmony. The silence between us lasted for months, until an unexpected phone call interrupted the tranquility I had achieved. It was my parents, their voices filled with accusation and indignation. Apparently, Chloe had gotten engaged, an event I was completely unaware of, and now they faced an unexpected problem. Many family members were turning down invitations to the wedding of the century. As my father explained, amid accusations, several relatives had decided not to participate in the celebration after learning how they had treated me. The ironic thing is that while they blamed me for ruining the family's reputation, they didn't realize that it was their own actions that caused this reaction. They tried to convince me that I had spread lies to sabotage Chloe's wedding out of envy for the lavish party they were planning. The reality, however, was much simpler. I had just told the truth, without exaggeration or dramatization. If this truth was generating negative consequences for them, perhaps it was time to reflect on their choices. After that accusatory phone call, I decided it was time for a definitive confrontation with my parents. For years, he had endured the unequal treatment in silence, trying not to rock the family boat and maintaining a semblance of normality. However, being accused of sabotaging Chloe's wedding when all I did was tell the truth was the final straw. I mentally prepared myself for a difficult conversation, knowing it would be emotionally draining. When I answered their next call, I let them start with their usual accusations that I was acting out of jealousy and envy. I took a deep breath and, for the first time in my life, I didn't hold back. "Yes, you are right on one point," I began, surprising them with my initial agreement. "I've always been jealous, but not for the reasons you might think. I've never envied Chloe for her talents or achievements. What always caused me pain was seeing how you two, who were supposed to love your children equally, always put her on a pedestal while I fought for crumbs of attention." My raw honesty seemed to have frozen my parents on the other end of the line. The silence that followed was more revealing than any verbal response. I continued, releasing decades of pent-up feelings. "I understand that the world prefers people like Chloe, prettier, smarter, more successful. But you're not the world, you're my parents. If even you couldn't see me beyond the constant comparison to my sister, how could I expect anyone else to?" My voice was shaking, not from fear, but from emotion held back for so long. I explained how I had always tried to earn their love on my own terms, how I watched every little moment they chose Chloe over me, and how I still kept in touch in the childish hope that one day it would be enough for them. I talked about the pain of realizing that not even in my marriage they were able to put my feelings first. Their reaction was defensive, as expected. They tried to turn the situation around, saying that I had always been insecure and that any perception of favoritism was a product of my imagination and inferiority complex. "If you feel neglected, it's not our fault," my mother argued as coldly as ever. It was then that I realized that I would never get an admission of error from them. They were so committed to the narrative they had constructed, of perfect parents with an extraordinary daughter and a problematic son, that to recognize any flaw would be to collapse the entire castle of self-image they had built over the years. Instead of continuing to argue, I changed my approach. "You are right on one point," he said calmly. "I can't prove how they treated me. But I also don't need your validation anymore. If the rest of the family is choosing not to go to Chloe's wedding, maybe they should ask themselves why instead of automatically blaming me." This change in perspective, from child begging for attention to adult setting limits, seemed to completely destabilize them. My ever-controlling father tried to regain control of the conversation with a veiled threat. "Since you've decided we're terrible parents and have such strong opinions about how we failed you, maybe we should go our separate ways." Their attempt to intimidate me with abandon, something they had already done in my marriage, no longer had any effect on me. "I agree," I replied simply. "You guys always made me feel like I was expendable in the family, so we're just making official what you've been practicing for years." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, they realized they could no longer control me with the threat of taking away a love they had never consistently shown. I ended the call with a feeling of peace that I didn't expect to feel. He had said everything he needed to say, without destructive anger, just with the honesty that he deserved to have expressed much earlier. The most surprising thing was realizing that I no longer cared what happened next. If my parents decided to reflect on their actions and seek reconciliation, I would be open to establishing a healthier relationship. If they chose to continue denying and blaming me, I would move on with my life without them. The freedom from this indifference was refreshing. No longer forced indifference to protect my feelings, but genuine emotional liberation. Emma noticed the difference immediately when I got home. "You feel lighter," she commented, hugging me. "Like I left a weight behind." And that's exactly how I felt. The following days brought a series of messages from extended family. Apparently, after our conversation, my parents intensified their campaign to try to save face and ensure everyone was present at Chloe's wedding. Their strategy was simple: portray me as a problematic, jealous, and lying son who invented stories to harm his sister out of pure envy of the luxurious party she would have. Ironically, this approach only reinforced the perception many already had about unequal treatment in our family. Uncles and cousins who had seen years of subtly disguised favoritism now saw the situation with crystal clarity. Many reached out to me to express support and share observations they had made over the years but had never mentioned in order to not cause trouble. One uncle in particular confessed, "We always noticed how differently your parents treated you, but we thought it wasn't our place to interfere." I now realize that our silence only allowed it to continue. The situation came to a head when Chloe decided to send me a message. Unlike my parents, who alternated between anger and manipulation, she opted for a moral high ground approach. "What you did to our parents was unforgivable," the message said. "They sacrificed everything for us, and this is your gratitude? You've always been like this, Jason, always victimizing yourself when things don't go your way." The message continued, rewriting our childhood as if I had received the same love and attention as she did, as if my feelings were just the result of a problematic personality. I didn't respond. I simply blocked his number, ending yet another toxic communication channel in my life. Hours later, she tried to contact Emma via phone, a move that demonstrated her desperation and lack of respect for boundaries. Once again, the message was the same. I needed to apologize to our parents for the show I had caused. Emma, always my biggest supporter, found the situation tragically comical. "It's amazing how they can't see their own behavior," she commented as we read the message together. "They accuse you of causing drama when they are the ones desperately trying to control the narrative." I agreed, allowing myself to see the humor in the situation. Years ago, a message like this would have devastated me, making me question my own perception of reality. Now, it only reinforced my decision to distance myself. The ironic thing was that, in their frantic attempt to control the damage to their reputation, my parents and Chloe were merely confirming everything I had shared with the family. Each accusatory message, each attempt to portray me as the villain, only solidified the realization that I had been truthful about my lifelong treatment. Over the next few weeks, we focused on our lives, Emma and I. We bought a new house, adopted a dog, and I started a new professional project that I had wanted to start for a long time. The absence of family drama made room for growth and genuine happiness. I occasionally received updates from relatives about the increasingly extravagant preparations for Chloe's wedding. Apparently my parents were compensating for the lack of guests with an increase in luxury and ostentation. Designer dress, exclusive venue, award-winning buffet. Nothing was good enough for the favorite daughter. Instead of feeling envy, as they would surely assume I would, I experienced only a gentle melancholy at the toxic dynamics that continued to control their lives. They had not yet understood that no amount of external awesomeness could fill the void left by a lack of authenticity and true connection. Controversy over Chloe's marriage spread like wildfire through the extended family, creating divisions no one could have predicted. On the one hand, my parents and my sister, outraged by the growing number of people refusing invitations. On the other, uncles, cousins, and even grandparents who, for the first time, were openly questioning the unequal treatment they had witnessed for years. The most surprising thing was receiving a call from my paternal grandmother, a traditionally reserved woman who rarely got involved in family conflicts. "Jason," she began, her voice firm despite her advanced age, "I want you to know that I will not be at Chloe's wedding. I cannot in good conscience celebrate with people who treated my grandson this way." Her statement took me completely by surprise. I never expected her, always so diplomatic, to take such a definitive position. She went on to explain that she had observed my parents' favoritism for years, but had always believed that it was not her role to interfere in raising her grandchildren. "Maybe it was my mistake too, for staying silent for so long," she admitted with a palpable sadness in her voice. As the weeks went by, I received more similar messages from other family members. My uncle Marcus, my father's older brother, shared how he always felt uncomfortable with the way I was treated at family gatherings. "Your father and I have had several discussions about this over the years," he revealed. "I always told you that one day you would grow up and realize you deserved more, and then it would be too late to fix the relationship." My cousin Eliza, who had always been close to Chloe, surprisingly got in touch too. "I've always considered Chloe my friend, but the way she talks about you, even when you're not there, has always bothered me," he confessed. "She constantly needs to diminish her achievements to feel superior, and her parents encourage this behavior." These revelations were simultaneously validating and painful. Validating for confirming that I was not imagining the different treatment, painful for realizing that so many people noticed but chose not to intervene. The most interesting part of this situation was how my parents reacted to the growing boycott of Chloe's wedding. Instead of reflecting on their actions and considering that perhaps they had made a mistake somewhere, they doubled down on the narrative that I was the manipulative villain. They began calling every family member who declined the invitation, spinning elaborate stories about how I had always been troubled and jealous, how I had distorted reality about my wedding day, and how I was now actively sabotaging Chloe's happiness. This desperate campaign had the opposite effect to that desired. As my cousin Derek later told me, the more they harped on about how terrible you were, the more obvious it became that they were projecting their own flaws. I've never seen your father so determined to convince anyone of anything, and it made me question why he needed so much for us to believe that version of events. The tension reached a new level when I discovered that my parents had begun spreading personal information about my financial and professional life, trying to paint a picture of failure compared to Chloe's success. Your brother always had a hard time settling down, my mother would say to anyone who would listen, conveniently omitting that they never supported my career choices or offered the same level of support as they did my sister. He's been working at that small company for years, with no growth, while Chloe is already a director in Silicon Valley. The manipulation was evident to anyone with critical sense, comparing completely different professional trajectories and using external indicators of success to justify unequal treatment. The ironically sad thing is that I was perfectly satisfied with my career, which provided me with flexibility, satisfaction, and time to cultivate meaningful relationships, something that Chloe, with her busy schedule, clearly did not prioritize. Emma, always my rock during this emotional storm, suggested that perhaps it was time to put this saga behind us completely. "They're going under on their own," she observed as we prepared dinner in our new kitchen, the dogs sleeping peacefully at our feet. "Each new attempt to defame you only solidifies in everyone's mind how dysfunctional this dynamic is. You don't have to do anything. Just living well is your best response." There was a deep wisdom in his words. For so long, I fought to be seen, to be valued, to be treated fairly. Now, ironically, the further I got away from this drama, the more visible the truth became to everyone around us. I decided to follow her advice and focus completely on building our life together, leaving my parents and Chloe to deal with the consequences of their own actions and choices. There was a certain poetry in the fact that by desperately trying to maintain their perfect image, they were inadvertently revealing their true colors to everyone. The last news I received about the wedding preparations came from my Aunt Laura, who was still in contact with my parents despite having decided not to attend the ceremony. "They have significantly scaled back the scale of the event," she reported during our monthly call. Apparently, less than half of the guests confirmed their attendance, and several vendors canceled after their father behaved inappropriately during a planning meeting. I felt no malicious satisfaction from this information, just a sad realization that my parents were now facing the natural consequences of years of manipulative and preferential behavior. His actions, not my words, had finally reached a tipping point where they could no longer be ignored or justified by the extended family. It was a situation they had created entirely on their own, and one they now had to navigate without the safety net of familial complacency that had always protected them. Most revealing was a message I received from a distant cousin who had grown up adoring Chloe and rarely interacted with me during our childhood. "I always thought you were the troubled one in the family, based on what your parents and Chloe said," he admitted with surprising sincerity. "But seeing how they're handling the situation, how they're willing to destroy decades-old family relationships just to maintain the illusion of perfection, made me question everything I thought I knew about their family." This recognition, coming from someone who had always been firmly in Chloe's camp, demonstrated how much the situation had changed. The masks were slipping, and the truth, as uncomfortable as it was finally coming out. It wasn't the public exposure I had sought in sharing my experience, but perhaps it was the necessary first step toward healing and transformation, not just for me, but potentially for the entire family dynamic. The week of Chloe's wedding has finally arrived, and with it an unexpected flurry of messages and calls. Relatives who had decided not to attend contacted me to confirm their decision, as if seeking reassurance that they were making the right choice. Others who chose to go felt the need to justify their presence, close ties to Chloe, previous commitments, or simply a desire to avoid further family conflict. I didn't judge any of these choices. Each person had their own relationship with my parents and my sister, regardless of my history with them. The most surprising thing was receiving a message from my cousin Jennifer, who would be Chloe's bridesmaid. "The dinner rehearsal yesterday was a disaster," she revealed. "Your parents had a public argument with the groom's parents about the costs of the ceremony. Chloe spent the entire night alternating between crying fits and tantrums, blaming you for ruining the most important day of her life." The irony of the situation was not lost on me. The same accusation they had leveled against me was now manifesting as a self-fulfilling prophecy. The day before the wedding, I received the most unexpected call of all: Chloe's fiancé, Ethan, a man I had only met briefly at a family dinner before my own estrangement. "Jason, I know this is weird, but I needed to talk to you," he began, visibly uncomfortable. "Over the last few months, I've seen a side of your family that's making me question a lot of things." He went on to explain how the obsession with the perfect marriage had turned toxic, how Chloe had become increasingly controlling, and how her parents fueled this behavior by constantly mentioning how I had sabotaged everything. "We started having serious arguments when I realized how she talks about you," he confessed. "There's so much unresolved resentment and competitiveness, and her parents seem to encourage that instead of helping her process those feelings in a healthy way." The conversation ended with him asking for advice on how to navigate these complicated family dynamics, a question to which I, ironically, was the last person able to offer a constructive answer. The wedding day came and went, and I received piecemeal updates from various family members. The ceremony took place with less than half of the originally expected guests. The atmosphere was described as tense and artificial, with my parents overly concerned with projecting a picture-perfect family image to the guests on the groom's side. An uncle reported hearing my mother explain my absence as a result of long-standing mental health issues, yet another attempt to control the narrative and portray me as the problematic one. The reception, despite all the extravagance and expensive details, was cut short when Chloe had an emotional breakdown after overhearing some guests commenting on the family situation in the bathrooms. According to my aunt, she yelled at her parents in front of everyone, accusing them of not doing enough to make sure her day was perfect. It was a sad spectacle that left many guests uncomfortable and confirmed what many already suspected. Behind the facade of perfection, there was a deeply dysfunctional dynamic. In the weeks following the wedding, something unexpected began to happen. Family members who had kept their distance from me for years, following the line established by my parents, began to re-establish contact. Cousins I hadn't seen since childhood invited me to lunches and meetings. Uncles who had always been cordial but distant began to show genuine interest in my life. It was as if Chloe's marriage had been a turning point for the entire family, a moment when the truth about the dysfunctional dynamic finally became impossible to ignore or justify. At a particularly revealing lunch with my Aunt Monica, my mother's sister, she shared, "Your mother was always like that, even when we were children. She needed to be the center of attention. She needed everything to be perfect in the eyes of others. When Chloe was born and showed herself to be extraordinary, she found in her daughter the perfect extension of herself. You, being your own individual, never fit into that narrative." The most surprising thing was that, through these new family connections, I discovered parts of my own family history that I had never known. Apparently, my father had also grown up in the shadow of a favored sibling, unconsciously replicating the same toxic pattern with his own children. My paternal grandmother, over a moving afternoon of coffee and memories, showed me old photos and shared stories that painted a different picture of my parents, not as monsters, but as deeply flawed people, carrying their own unresolved traumas. "That doesn't justify how they treated you," she emphasized, holding my hands with surprising strength for someone her age. "But maybe it will help you understand that it was never about you not being enough. They are repeating patterns that they themselves have suffered." This perspective brought an understanding that, while it didn't alleviate the pain of the past, offered a broader context in which to process my experiences. For the first time, I saw my parents not just as figures who had hurt me, but as complex people with their own stories of unresolved pain. This didn't absolve them of responsibility, but it helped me free myself from the cycle of resentment that, if not broken, could have consumed me in the same way it consumed my family. Emma, with her usual wisdom, observed how this knowledge was transforming me. "You're seeing the situation more clearly now," she said one evening as we walked our dog through the park. "It's not about forgiving and forgetting, but about understanding and moving forward without carrying the weight of that resentment." His eyes shone with pride as he added, "Maybe you're the one who's finally breaking this toxic cycle that's run through generations in your family." Those words touched something deep in me, The realization that true victory wasn't in receiving validation from my parents or proving them wrong, but in choosing a different path for my own life, one that didn't perpetuate the same destructive patterns. Life has an interesting way of offering lessons when we least expect them. 3 months after Chloe's wedding, I received an email I never imagined would arrive. It was from Ethan, now officially my brother-in-law, asking us to meet without the rest of the family knowing. I confess that my first reaction was distrust. Was this another attempt at manipulation orchestrated by my parents? After consulting Emma, who has always been my moral compass on this chaotic journey, I decided to accept the invitation. We set up at a discreet cafe halfway between our homes, on an ordinary Tuesday that would end up being anything but ordinary. When I arrived, Ethan was already there, visibly nervous, twirling his coffee cup between his fingers. "Thank you for coming," he began. "I didn't know if you'd accept it, considering everything." His tone was sincere, without any trace of the hostility or judgment I had become accustomed to receiving from my family. "Things have been complicated since the wedding." For the next 2 hours, Ethan vented about the reality behind appearances. The perfect marriage was falling apart before it even started. Chloe had become increasingly controlling and emotionally unstable. My parents constantly interfered in the relationship, turning any disagreement into a family crisis. The worst thing, according to him, was how everyone constantly used me as a negative example. The problematic brother, the disappointed son, the warning about what happens when someone doesn't follow the established rules. "I started to notice a pattern," he explained. "Whenever something went wrong, it was compared to you or used as an example of what you would have done. It made me question the version of the story I was told." Ethan revealed that he had started therapy to deal with the constant pressure, and through this process, he recognized the signs of a toxic family dynamic. He was seriously considering separating from Chloe, just 4 months after the wedding, but he feared the consequences. "Your parents have already threatened to ruin my career if I hurt Chloe," he confessed, his voice lowering as if he feared being overheard. "They have connections at my company." As I listened to him, I felt a mix of emotions: validation at having my experience confirmed by an outsider, sadness at the perpetuation of these destructive patterns, and most importantly, compassion for Ethan, now trapped in the same toxic web that I had finally escaped. That meeting with Ethan marked the beginning of an unexpected alliance. We didn't become best friends overnight, but we established a line of communication based on mutual respect and shared understanding. I offered him what I never received from my own family: a non-judgmental listening ear and validation for his feelings and perceptions. I shared resources that had helped me on my own journey: books about dysfunctional families, information about parental narcissism, techniques for setting healthy boundaries. I suggested names of therapists who specialize in toxic relationships. Most importantly, I assured him that I wasn't crazy for questioning the reality that my family presented as absolute truth. "Gaslighting is his favorite tool," I explained. "They make you doubt your own perception until it becomes easier to accept their version than to trust yourself." In the weeks following that first meeting, I learned from family members that the situation at home was rapidly deteriorating. Chloe had discovered that Ethan was seeking therapy and took it as a personal betrayal. My parents, predictable as ever, supported this view, suggesting that he was probably poisoning the therapist against the family. The pressure on Ethan increased: constant messages during work hours, surprise office checks, demands that he drop out of therapy to prove his loyalty. What none of them knew was that Ethan had begun documenting everything: every manipulative message, every veiled threat, every attempt to isolate him from friends and colleagues. When he finally decided to leave the marriage, 5 months after the ceremony, he was prepared for the storm he knew was coming. "Your advice was invaluable," he told me in our last conversation before beginning the divorce process. "You showed me that it is possible to escape without losing yourself in the process." My family's reaction to the impending divorce was exactly as we expected. Chloe reportedly alternated between bouts of destructive rage and periods of dramatic victimization. My parents mobilized all their resources, financial, social, and emotional, to save their perfect daughter's marriage, which could not, under any circumstances, fail so publicly. The official narrative, quickly disseminated among friends and acquaintances, was that Ethan had changed after the marriage, revealing himself to be manipulative and abusive. And, of course, I was promptly identified as the hidden villain. Apparently, I had poisoned Ethan against the family during our secret conversations, which, somehow, they discovered. This accusation, as absurd as it was predictable, only confirmed to Ethan that he was making the right decision. "If they have to invent conspiracies to explain why someone wants to leave them," he observed with new clarity, "perhaps the problem is with them, not with others." The divorce was finalized surprisingly quickly considering the circumstances. Ethan had prepared meticulously, with documented evidence of controlling behavior and threats. When my parents tried to make good on their promise to harm his career, he had already preemptively spoken to his superiors, explaining the situation and sharing some of the threatening emails he had received. Instead of destroying him professionally, my parents only ended up solidifying their position at the company, whose executives were alarmed by attempts at outside interference. It was a powerful lesson in how the truth, when presented calmly and with evidence, often prevails over manipulation and threats. As I watched the situation unfold from a distance, I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. Vindication at seeing others finally realize what I had always known, sadness at the perpetuation of this destructive cycle that continued to cause harm to everyone involved. A year after my wedding, that pivotal moment that catalyzed this entire family transformation, I received the most unexpected piece of correspondence, a handwritten letter from my mother. Not an easily ignorable email or a text message that could be misinterpreted, but a real letter, on quality paper, with the elegant handwriting she was always proud to possess. I sat with Emma in our newly planted garden, the late afternoon sun creating long shadows, our dog sleeping peacefully at our feet, as I opened the envelope with slightly shaking hands. "Jason," the letter began, without the usual accusatory or defensive tone, "I'm writing because I finally understand something important. I can't change the past, but maybe I can learn from it." It continued with a surprisingly honest reflection on how the patterns of her own childhood had shaped her parenting, how her fear of failure led her to project impossible expectations onto her perfect daughter and to neglect the son who didn't fit this predefined narrative of success. The letter contained no specific requests for forgiveness, no explicit attempt at reconciliation or resumption of contact. It was simply an acknowledgement, the first real one I had ever received from her, that mistakes had been made, that my experience had validity, that my pain was not simply the product of a difficult or oversensitive personality. It mentioned that she had entered therapy following the collapse of Chloe's marriage and subsequent estrangement from her daughter, who had always been the center of her parental identity. "I lost both my children," she wrote, "and only now do I realize how much my own actions contributed to that." There was no mention of my father, no indication of whether he shared this new perspective or remained entrenched in his original view of events. The letter ended simply with, "I'm trying to learn and grow. Your mother, Elizabeth." No stated expectations, no pressure, just a door ajar should I ever choose to walk through it. I didn't respond immediately. I needed to process my own feelings, which were surprisingly complex. There was skepticism, of course. Years of manipulation don't disappear with a single letter, no matter how seemingly sincere. There was wariness about opening myself up again to someone who had repeatedly proven their ability to cause pain. But there was also a small, almost imperceptible seed of hope, not necessarily for a complete reconciliation or a traditional mother-son relationship, but for some form of resolution that would allow for true inner peace. Emma, as always, offered valuable perspective. "You don't have to decide now," she reminded me as we put the letter away. "You don't even need to decide anything definitive. Relationships are not static. They evolve, retreat, transform. The important thing is that you maintain your limits and your truth, regardless of the path you choose." His words, like so many times before, grounded me in present reality, reminding me that my life was no longer defined by that toxic family dynamic. Looking back, I realized that that absence from my wedding, that painful moment that I so often relived in my mind, was actually a pivotal turning point in my life. It was the catalyst that finally allowed me to break out of dysfunctional patterns that had imprisoned me for decades. This is not a satisfying revenge tale where the villain gets exactly what he deserves in the dramatic ending. It's a much more nuanced story about growth, truth, and the courage to choose a different path, even when it means abandoning what we've always known. The real transformation didn't come when my parents finally faced the consequences of their actions, or when others recognized the unfair treatment I received. It came when I stopped looking for external validation and started trusting my own perception of reality. If you're going through something similar, feeling invisible in your own family, constantly compared and found wanting, know that your experience is valid. Your pain is real, and you are not alone on this journey. The first and most important step is to recognize that there is nothing wrong with being who you are, even if you don't fit the expectations that others project of you. Ask yourself, how much longer will you try to change to gain the love that should be unconditional? How much energy will you still invest in relationships that consistently bring you down instead of uplifting you? What could you accomplish if you redirected all that energy toward your own growth and happiness? Setting healthy boundaries isn't selfish, it's self-preservation. Sometimes temporary or permanent distancing is necessary to break toxic cycles that persist for generations. In my case, it took complete withdrawal to finally find clarity and peace. For you, the path may be different. It may be possible to maintain limited contact with appropriate emotional protections. Perhaps there are family members willing to work on a healthier relationship. Or perhaps, as it was for me initially, full distance is the only viable option. There is no universal solution, just what works for you, in your unique context, with your specific needs. The most transformative part of this journey was realizing that I don't need to carry the weight of rejection as if it were my fault. My parents' inability to see and value me for who I really am reflects their limitations, not mine. This understanding freed me to build genuine relationships based on mutual acceptance and respect, beginning with my marriage to Emma and expanding to meaningful friendships and renewed family connections with relatives who chose to see beyond the facade. The family we built, not necessarily through blood ties, but through conscious choice, became my true home, my safe haven in an often chaotic and unpredictable world. And what about the future? Remain open, not defined by past resentments or rigid expectations. My mother's letter represents a possibility, not of returning to what was before, but perhaps of building something new, more authentic and balanced. Perhaps one day Chloe will also find her way out of the role she was assigned, realizing the emotional cost of being the perfect child in this dysfunctional dynamic. Or perhaps some relationships remain distant, recognizing that not all family ties can or should be saved. And that's fine too. True liberation comes when we realize that we have a choice, that we are not obligated to maintain connections that harm us just because we share DNA or history. Now, I'd like to hear from you. Does this story resonate with your own experiences? Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries in family relationships? Or maybe you're in that process right now, trying to find a balance between honoring your needs and maintaining important connections? Share in the comments below. Your insights could be just what someone else needs to hear today. And if this story touched you in any way, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. We will continue exploring themes related to complex family dynamics, personal development, and the courage to live authentically, even when that means defying established expectations.